Accessible and inclusive communities. What makes a community truly accessible and inclusive, and what evidence is missing? Starting with lived experience and expertise. What needs to change from the perspective of people with disability who live it? These reflections are provocations to shape research, policy, and action. These are the personal reflections from their lives. Introducing Jane Spring AM, disability advocate and leader focused on inclusive communities and systemic change.
Hello, my name is Jane Spring. I've been paraplegic since 1990. I currently chair Disability Council New South Wales and Australia's Disability Strategy Advisory Council. I'm also a board member of Royal Rehab, where I did my own rehabilitation. So I'm quite close to the disability community. When I think about what an accessible and inclusive community looks like, it's actually very simple. It's a community where I can do the things that I want without consistently thinking about barriers. It means being able to get to the beach and into the surf with my friends. It means getting out into the bush. It means traveling around Australia or even the world without constantly worrying about whether I'll find an accessible bathroom. In short, it's about freedom and spontaneity and not having to plan every movement around accessibility. But the reality is that many barriers still exist every day. Our streets, landscapes, and buildings are often poorly thought through, poorly built, or poorly maintained. When I'm moving around the community, I'm constantly looking down, checking curb ramps, uneven footpaths, and obstacles for my wheelchair. And when I arrive somewhere, I'm still wondering, will the door be easy to open? Will there be an accessible bathroom? And if there is one, will it be clean and usable? These might sound like small things, but they determine whether people with disability can participate fully in everyday life. When it comes to research, one of the most important things is that researchers ask the questions people with disability actually want answered. A lot of research is still driven by medical and clinical perspectives. Now that work is important, but it's not the whole story. For me, the research I care about is the path from rehabilitation to a satisfying life. For example, for people with spinal cord injuries, how do we maintain strength and mobility across decades? How do we protect our shoulders, which are essential for our independence? And how do we maintain bone density and long-term health? These are the practical questions that really matter to people living with disability like mine. But I'm also very interested in research about culture and attitudes. Physical access matters enormously, but attitudes can be just as significant a barrier. So what actually changes community attitudes about disability? What storytelling helps people understand our lives in a human and respectful way? And how do we avoid backlash, particularly when there are misconceptions about disability support, like that coming from the NDIS? Employment is another example. Many organisations say they want to employ people with disability, but they don't know how. Sometimes the real issue is deeply held assumptions about capability. And I think we also need more research about leadership and governance. What are the best ways to get people with disability onto boards and into leadership roles? And once they're there, how do we ensure that their voices are effective in shaping strategy and influencing the implementation of policies and programs? Because the real inclusion often happens when organisations, whether government or business, have the leaders with the lived experience of disability helping to guide decision making. And finally, I'm really interested in research about co-design. As a disability community, we talk about co-design a lot, but what does it really mean in practice? How can governments and businesses confidently partner with people with disability to design policies, programs and products, and then measure whether the changes that are made are actually working? And how do we ensure that there are real feedback loops so people with disability continue to inform and improve those decisions over time? Because if we get these things right, accessibility, attitudes, and genuine partnership, we can build the communities where people with disability can live full, ordinary, and connected lives. And that's what inclusion should really mean. Thank you.
Introducing Jeff Trappett, OAM, Advocate for Inclusive Systems from the Ground Up.
My name is Jeff Trappett, and I'm a disabled leader with a focus on building inclusive systems from the ground up. My work is rooted in the belief that for inclusion to be sustainable, it has to be built into the very foundation of an organisation or community. Often we see what I'd refer to as stagnant inclusion, policies that exist on paper or exist as a pilot but don't change the daily reality for people with a disability. When we talk about barriers, the biggest one is often a lack of imagination regarding scale. What can we do at scale to make the biggest difference for the most amount of people? In my experience, particularly with large-scale employers like the ASX companies that I've worked with, the gap isn't just a lack of resources. It's a lack of forming that base. We see plenty of top-down policy, but not enough structural change that actually reaches the community level. Researchers need to start asking, how do we move from pilot projects to systemic scale with limited resources? And when I say limited resources, I don't just mean resources in terms of finances. I mean resources in terms of thinking, in terms of cultural well-being within an organisation, that desire to change. The evidence that's currently missing is how to implement intersectional and universal design at scale. We have plenty of small-scale success stories, but we lack the data on how to embed these into the DNA of large organisations and government systems. Researchers should be asking, how do we move from accommodating disability to anticipating it? We need research that measures the social and economic impact of communities that are accessible to everyone, regarding of how they move, communicate or process information. If I had to prioritise one change, it would be a shift in funding and policy towards universal design as the default. We need to move away from retrofitting and towards a base-up model where every community space, digital platform and social system is built for all of us from day one. One change would be shifting the focus of research and funding towards implementation at scale. We have enough of the why. We need more of the how that's grounded in the expertise of those with lived experience. Right now we have fragmented inclusion. A community might have a physical ramp, but no quiet space for neurodivergent people, or a website that isn't screen reader accessible. When we only solve for one type of disability, we leave the rest of the community behind. Where communities fall short is in the invisible barriers, the complex systems, the communication gaps, and the social attitudes that suggest inclusion is an extra rather than a fundamental right. We need to stop treating people with disability as a series of separate problems to solve and start seeing it as a core part of human diversity.
Introducing Luke Nelson, Advocate focused on strengthening inclusion and representation in community decision-making.
Hi, my name is Luke Nelson. I'm a disability self-advocate. I'm connected in so many different ways. I believe that one thing good in Australia is we have accessible buildings. We have that law for community. But one thing I think we do need to look at is how strongly we need to promote that law and encourage people to have more accessible buildings, but also around accessible information in the community, whether it's in Braille or an easy read, maybe accessible guides in the city for people with disabilities, whether that's people in the city that is there to help people with disabilities, or whether it's around making accessible transport better, also about having more accessible buses and the transport conversation in general, but also we need to make sure that the community is inclusive for all disabilities, not just intellectual in this case, in my case, but whether we have options for easier access to language, whether it's written or verbal or easy read. I want to get easy read more accepted within the community. So I don't know whether it's about doing a massive project on that specifically, an easy read standard, but also around making sure that people have time and also to have time to cross the roads, for example, having lights that give more time to people with disabilities, and also having accessible bathrooms in the community. Now, what I mean by that is more accessible bathrooms, and whether it's a sensor on the door or buttons that you can push to know more about the city, because Melbourne is a beautiful city in this case. But we want to make sure that it's inclusive for every person with a disability. Thank you very much.
Introducing Jane Britt, champion of lived expertise in policy and practice.
I'm Jane Britt. I'm a disability policy advocate working at the intersection of disability policy, governance and government relations. I'm also a person with disability. I'm deafblind. I want to reflect on what inclusive communities look like, where we're still failing short, and what research should focus on next. Accessible community for me is one that is normalised, where accessible design has been considered in streets, buildings and infrastructure, so that people with disability can move through life without having to negotiate every step of the way. So I want to give an example of this with me navigating my local streets with a white cane. I'm constantly reading the environment through touch, through that cane. So where tactile ground indicators that are on the ground that help me be able to be oriented and navigate my way, where there are cracks, bumps and also uneven pavement. But there are also things in my environment that weren't designed with navigation in mind. So scooters left across pathways, shared pedestrian spaces with bikes and other pedestrians in narrow areas, or quite electric and hybrid vehicles, which is problematic when you're using the traffic sound to be able to work out when to safely cross a road. Inclusive community is one where that negotiation isn't necessary in the first place because the community has been built in an inclusive and accessible way, and it's been designed into that environment, not retrofitted later. Is treated as compliance rather than a pathway to participation and belonging, accessibility efforts often fail. When we think about the research, yes, what we really need here is stronger empirical evidence about what implementation actually looks like on the ground. Because for people like me navigating our communities every day, policy only matters if it translates into environments that actually work. So when policy frameworks fail, I found it's usually because of two things. One, the data is inadequate and good policy is not built on that data, especially if it's bad. And if the evidence base is weak, incomplete or disconnected from our actual lived experience of disability, the policies it's built on will struggle to deliver meaningful change. But second, there's often a lack of effective follow-through. So the research might be done, but then there's no ongoing evaluation and monitoring work to actually work out if the implementation of anything has been effective. What my hope is for the future is that more people with disability will continue to shape the research, policy and leadership. What gives me hope for the future is that more people with disability are shaping research, policy and leadership themselves. And that perspective changes the questions we ask and the solutions we design. We also know from the Disability Royal Commission that governance works best when decision-making sits close to the people whose lives are affected by it. If I could prioritise one change, it would be embedding lived experience directly into decision-making, not consultation at the end, but as leadership and governance from the beginning. Accessibility is a lens on whether communities function for human diversity. So my takeaway question for you, are you viewing your research and the people like me that it impacts through that lens?
Introducing Ruth Farragher, advocate and leader focused on inclusion and participation for people with intellectual disability.
Hi, I'm Ruth Barriger and I have Down syndrome. I have been working as a self-advocate for more than 20 years. I want people to understand about Down syndrome. I also do research. I want the world to be better for people with intellectual disabilities. We often get forgotten by researchers. What does an inclusive community mean to me? Well, it is for everyone. It means being with other people. I like to be with friends. What makes it hard to take part? It is hard for people with disabilities to find a partner and stay in relationships. Sometimes workplaces can be hard. Some bosses don't understand disabilities. Voting needs to be easy for people with disabilities. Party volunteers need to know what the policies about disabilities are. I can then choose who has the best policy for disabilities. What should researchers be asking? We need new employment ideas. We need more ways to work from home in good jobs. We need to know why jobs don't last. People with disabilities don't get good jobs, and they find it hard to keep them. Getting a house is hard. I don't want to live by myself. I want to have a share house with my friends, and I want to live with people with disabilities and without disabilities. We need to have better choices about where we live. I don't want a support worker telling me what to do. Researchers should be finding out how to help people get relationships safely. Thank you for asking me what I think. I like that you are asking me. Thank you for listening.
Introducing Sarah McInnes, advocate for practical, everyday inclusion.
My name is Sarah McInnes, and aside from my work, I am someone who identifies as having a disability. At 16, I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and this experience shaped my perspective on disability rights and the impact having an accessible and inclusive community can have, both when it exists and when it's missing. To me, an accessible and inclusive community is one where everyone feels welcome, included, and is able to participate fully. Whilst accessibility is often associated with physical features like ramps, regulated curb cuts, braille signage, and low sensory spaces, just to name a few, it also extends to the attitudes and values held within the community. True inclusion means ensuring that all people feel recognised, respected, and are treated with dignity, not as exceptions, but as valued members of society. As a community, we have a shared responsibility to remove visible and invisible barriers so that no one is excluded due to ignorance or indifference. This requires us to challenge everyday ableism in how we speak, act, and design our communities, and to move towards environments that celebrate diversity rather than merely tolerates it. Second, despite ongoing advocacy and improvements in accessibility, significant barriers still exist for people living with disability. Whilst physical access is often the focus and holds great importance, one of the most pervasive challenges remains attitudes within the broader community. People with disability are frequently infantilized, underestimated, or framed as inspirational, simply for living their lives. Achieving genuine inclusion requires more than just structural adjustments. It requires a cultural shift. Society must move beyond outdated narratives and begin recognizing people with disability as equal participants in everyday life. Lastly, what gives me hope for the future is the fact that there are now so many amazing advocacy and research bodies striving to make a difference to the lives of people living with disability. Seeing the very tangible difference research and advocacy can have on someone's life, whether it's through assisting them to access the NDIS or government payments, or challenging discrimination in the workplace or education settings. Making someone feel heard, believed, and supported to know that they belong, they add value, and they have every right to be who they are. That fills me with hope for the future, a future that's hopefully just around the corner. Thank you for your time.
Introducing Jason McCurry, a community leader strengthening disability voice.
Hi there, my name is Jason McCurry. I'm a young person with disability. I live with Tourette syndrome, anxiety, and OCD. And I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in Naarm in Melbourne. I grew up in a small country town, about 3 hours outside of Melbourne, in a town full of about 3,000 people. Where I lived, there wasn't a lot of diversity or difference, and that was tricky growing up, and probably led to me not really owning my disability or my disability diagnosis from an identity perspective until I was older, in my 20s, when I'd moved to Melbourne. Accessible and inclusive communities is a very broad topic. It means to me being accepted for who I am, including what I can't control. So sometimes my tics, my outbursts, or my thoughts in all spaces in life and society, where I want to be and where I deserve to be. This includes school, university, sport, supermarkets, and public transport. In schooling, reflecting back there wasn't a lot of diversity at school or where I lived, and I think that lack of exposure, as I shared earlier, kind of really played an impact on me. I had overall quite a positive experience with inclusion in the community and school and with friends and family. But that lack of diversity really changed who I could be at that time, who I looked up to, and what I thought about disability and disability identity. I think that lack of exposure in schooling led to around that lack of training around differences on diversity and disability. I think some challenging things looking back was people talking behind my back about me or mimicking my tics, so getting picked on. That was quite hard. Other places in the community that are tricky to access, I think, are supermarkets and public transport. I think from a sensory perspective, anyone that's neurodivergent would understand this. Lighting, incredibly bright, not neon lighting, but fluorescent lighting. Noise, a lot of background noise, a lot of radio ads, that kind of thing, a lot of beeping. It's a sensory nightmare, really. So I think looking at a universal access perspective, how do we reduce some of these sounds and lights? Are they favouring anyone? Or if we remove them for all the neurodivergent people, would that actually benefit a lot of other people, such as people who prefer it quieter, people who get stressed in those environments, the elderly, the list goes on. Other places in my life, I've always liked sport, participating in sport and watching sport, and I've always liked sport as a vehicle for change, what sport can do. So that's both participating in sport and giving someone that opportunity to play the sport they've always loved for the first time, no matter what their disability, but also using sport as a vehicle for change. So at the elite level, trying to change club members' viewpoints through the power of sport and bringing people together through the power of sport or the love of a club. Some recent wins here in sport are events like the Australian Open in Australia, are like local football games that pairing up with venues and offering sensory sensory friendly spaces. There's a lot more patron services around accessibility. We are seeing some improvements there, which is great, and I'd love to see that continue to improve even more, investment in that space even more, and for that to improve even on a quicker basis. Some other areas in my life where I think of accessible and inclusive communities is music and gigs. I love getting to pubs and festivals and gigs, and whether that's having a drink or a meal or seeing a live gig with friends with disability and without disability, like everyone else should be able to access. There's still a big gap there. There are some improvements being made, and some organisations leading the way around consultancy and different accessibility tools, different technology leading the way there, but so many venues, especially the older pubs and band rooms, are just not accessible for so many different disabilities. So overall, in summary, universal access should be the focus, should be the objective for anyone in their roles in policy and practice. It's just providing the basics so that everyone can be where they want to be and where they deserve to be. Thanks for listening, and I hope this is helpful for your discussion today.